Hello and welcome to Tangled Twists. I'm Melissa and today we will be making 18th century stays with my floral fabric. I am so excited to be making another set of stays. I made stays over last summer. I did my full mock-up and I did my stay creation so that I could get a chance to wear them, but I didn't plan on this to be fancy, which it very much is not. I mean, the colors are very plain. It's plain on the inside, it's plain on the outside. It does what it needs to do. It's very comfortable, it's very supportive, but I want something a little bit prettier. This is the Cassandra pattern from Scroop Patterns for their stays. It's fantastic. I didn't have to do a whole lot of alterations on it at all. 10 out of 10 recommend. But I figured it was time for me to make some visible stays. Now, stays are typically a supportive undergarment. In wealthier classes, you would almost never see them. In some of the lower classes, you would, because you wouldn't necessarily want to get your jacket dirty while you're working, and there's only so many layers that you would have. So my goal is to make some stays that are pretty, that I can just wear like I would wear my average bodice. And back in January of 2025, I found this. I love this fabric. I found it on an unsupervised trip to Joann's, and then I left it on my couch and I looked at it every day, and then I bought 8 more yards. And at the time, I was really torn about doing that. But since the news that Joann's is closing all of their stores and I went back online and looked, this doesn't exist anymore. So I am really, really glad I got the fabric that I did. But it also means I can't ever get any more. So I'm going to be extra careful when I cut this out. I'm always doing my best to conserve as much fabric as possible. But in this case, I have the piece that I've got right here. This is 1 yard and 22 inches. My other piece is an 8-yard roll. That is all I have. That is all I can get. I cannot ever add more. So while I'm cutting these pieces, I'm going to be paying attention to a couple different things. I'm trying to minimize waste, and I'm trying to leave the biggest possible pieces remaining, because anything that I don't use here, I can potentially use on the other pieces. So I'm going to try to end up with a full set of 18th century garments made with this fabric. And to do that, I'm going to conserve as much fabric as I can. It should be an interesting ride. I really do spend far too much time on my kitchen floor. And here we are again. I'm doing some extra steps to prepare my fabric this time. What you're seeing is me checking the grain of the fabric. I'm lining the marks on the ruler up with some slubs in the fabric. Slubs are thick spots in the thread. They're very obvious and very visible. And I'm checking to see if they drift up or down along the line on the ruler. It's very important for support garments to be what's called on grain. That means all the woven fibers are going in the same direction and all the pieces follow the up and down, or the warp threads, of the fabric. It makes the garment stronger and prevents wrinkling. I'm checking this fabric because it's a printed pattern, and sometimes fabric doesn't feed evenly through the printing process. It's not uncommon for the edges to get pulled off grain, and that's exactly what I'm seeing here. For anything else, it wouldn't make a huge difference, but since we're making stays, it does, and I'll be taking steps to correct the grain later. The other thing I'm doing, even before pressing this fabric out, is checking to see how my pieces will fit on the fabric. I'm doing this specifically to confirm that they will fit on the fabric the way I think they will. If it doesn't, I'll have to try out alternative placements. Normally, I would just assume that it would work out. I'm being fussy here entirely because I'm trying to get the maximum use out of this fabric. I am skipping making sure the pieces are fully and completely on grain though. I know the grain is off and that will affect how the pieces sit, so I'm eyeballing it right now to get it roughly straight, and I'll be more careful later. By doing the check before I press, I'm also giving myself some extra time to think about the layout. I found in the past that sometimes when I think I have a good layout, it turns out not to be, so I always try to give it some extra time to cook in my brain to make sure I'm making good choices. Since I am trying to conserve fabric, I'm not trying to do pattern matching. I'd love to try it on this fabric, but getting the pattern to match across pieces takes a lot of waste, and I need this fabric to go as far as possible if I'm going to get all my other garments out of it. I got really lucky here because it looks like all my pieces are going to fit across one band of fabric, as long as I kick a tiny bit of seam allowance into the non-printed area. That's okay by me, as it won't show up in the finished stays. I've given my pattern layout a day to marinate, and I didn't spot any problems with it, so I've taken the fabric to the board for pressing. Stays aren't typically washed, and you want the fabric to have some stiffness, so unlike most projects, I haven't washed this fabric yet. That means any sizing, which is a treatment that's put on fabric to make it stay stiffer and flat, is still in there. On garments that I intend to wash, I would pre-wash my fabric to remove that sizing. There aren't a lot of wrinkles on the fabric, but I want everything nice and flat, and I'm going to use steam with my iron to correct the fabric grain. Also, I'm going to have to press my pieces as I make the stays, so it's important to be sure that I've pressed the fabric before then. It doesn't happen much on cotton, but pressing with steam can sometimes cause the fabric to shrink a tiny bit. I want that to happen before I cut the pieces out, so I'm on full heat with steam. I'm working on the unprinted side of the fabric to extend the life of the print. Sometimes with upholstery fabric, which this is, direct heat can cause damage to the print. That's not something I expect to happen, but since I know it can, I'm being a little extra careful. After I've done the first press and gotten the fabric warmed up a little, I can start working to correct the grain. To do that, I'm working along the edges of the fabric where the grain has drifted. I'm lining the grain up to where it's supposed to be by tugging on the fabric, and I'm using heat and steam from the iron to set the fibers in their new position. You can't always correct grain like this. It's working here because the grain isn't really that far off from where it should be. In more extreme examples, it's much more difficult and not always worth doing. I'm sure you've also noticed that I didn't press the entire piece. I don't know what that excess is going to be used for yet, and I am lazy. What I do know is that I'm not going to use the leftovers right now. That means the fabric will get piled somewhere and re-wrinkled. I hate rework, so I'm not spending extra time pressing fabric I don't need yet. Correctly cutting out the pattern pieces is the single most important part of making stays. The goal is to have every piece perfectly on grain. Because of that, I cut every single piece individually for all 3 layers. This is a very painstaking process. It takes me about an hour each to cut the outer and middle layers, and an hour and a half to do the inner layer. Don't worry, I'm not going to take you through 3+ hours of cutting. We're just going to hit the highlights. To get my pieces on grain, I'm using my clear quilting ruler. I'm lining it up with the selvage edge, that's the woven edge of the fabric, and I use the lines on the ruler to line up the grain lines of the pattern pieces. My ruler is only 2 feet long though, so I need to make sure that I'm securing my pattern pieces so that I can use them to line up the pieces that are farther away from the edge. I'm doing this on the back of the fabric so that I can easily mark it up. I trace around each piece with my chalk pencil, being very careful not to bump anything. This isn't the layer that needs the pattern markings, so I am only tracing the pattern piece outline. When I remove the pattern, I label the fabric at the top of each piece so I know which pattern piece it is. Even though it won't be seen on this piece, I like to put my labels in the seam allowance space. It's good practice in case you need to label on the front of your fabric, or if you're not sure if the markings will come off or if it might bleed through. I don't cut around the paper pattern because cutting shifts the fabric and can move the paper piece. Traced lines can't move, so when I cut, I know I'm cutting where I was meant to. At this point, you're probably wondering why I don't just fold the fabric in half and cut both sets of pieces at the same time. It is completely possible to do that, and there are many excellent corset and stay makers who do. I am not one of them. Anytime I try to layer my fabric for cutting, the fabric that I can't see always seems to end up just a little wonky. Maybe that's okay, and I'm being far more fussy than I need to be, but this is only my 3rd time making stays, and I am not risking my irreplaceable fabric. A quick little note here. I am cutting out the middle layer of fabric that I'm using coutil for, and you'll notice that this piece here is upside down. I'm using a method called top and tail, where you flip some pieces right side up and upside down in order to conserve space. I couldn't do this on the main fabric because it has a pattern, but this fabric is just like a simple twill, and honestly, it doesn't matter if it's going this way up or this way up, as long as I'm on grain. As long as I'm on grain, everything is fine. So I've got my system set up where I'm checking my grain off the side, getting everything all lined up, and then I use the same trace and cut process that I used on the main fabric. We are on to the final and most complicated part of cutting out pieces for this pattern. Like with any pattern, I have marks that I need to transfer from the paper pattern to the fabric. I fortunately do not need all of these lines. This is a mark for the waist. I use that on the mock-up. I don't need that on this final piece, but I do need these darker marked boning channel lines. I'll be able to make the rest of them based on where these are positioned. I need the seam allowance lines so that I can make sure my pieces are lining up the way they're supposed to. And I need the registration marks. That's so I can line up all of my tabs and have all of my pieces fit. The other reason for the seam allowance marks is so that I know where all the tabs are supposed to go. That's important for later. And when you look at this, you'll see that there's a lot of puncture marks on this. That's because to get these marks to this fabric, which you can kind of see here, I've already done this one. I'm doing it very lightly because this is the interior of my garment and I don't want to have a ton of blue marks on it. They will fade off. I'm using a chalk pencil, so I have to be careful not to like rub this over much. But the way I get these figured out is with this lovely little marking wheel here. What this does is I run it along what I'm trying to mark, and it leaves an almost imperceptible line on the fabric on the other side. And I'm going to try to capture that for you. So I go over each and everything that I need to transfer, and this shows me where it is on the fabric. I've learned for myself that it works the best if I pull the wheel towards myself. If I'm pushing away, I find that I lose track of where the lines are. So I do a little bit better pulling forward. Your mileage may vary. And I go over the whole thing, and then I haven't traced this one yet, but I leave the pattern in place as long as possible. So if I didn't have something come through, I can retrace it and make sure my lines all go where they're supposed to. So I'm going to run all the lines on this piece, and I'm going to try to show you what those dots look like. All right, I've done my tracing, and now we're going to see what we can see. So I'm gently picking up this corner. You see right along there, those almost imperceptible changes to the fabric. That's that line. On this fabric, it is sometimes really hard to see those. You've got a couple go across here. I might need to remark that. And you can see it, oh, just barely coming up along here. So as I do each piece, this is what I'm looking at, and I will take my pencil and come along and mark that. Slow and steady and nice and careful. Did it come out well over here? Yeah, you can see it a little bit there. There's that corner, the line. So I have to mark all of those, and then when I've done all of the pieces, I get to cut them out and I can finally start sewing. I have one last preparation step to do on my stay panels before I can start sewing for real. And that is I need to take all of these individual pieces and make them into whole piece packets. The reason for this is that I'm going to be putting boning channels on these, and I need all of the fabric to stay together. Why am I not using pins? Well, there's a very good reason for that, and I will show you over here. Fabric, even though it is two-dimensional, when you stick a pin in it, it starts to become three-dimensional. So if I stick this pin through here, that fabric wants to bubble now. It wants to have that change in shape that the pin is forcing it to have. So when I put these packets together, I end up stitching in the seam allowance around it because this prevents that. You can see even a little bit of tension in the light and shadows on this piece from where the thread's gone through, but it's much, much less than what's happening with this pin. So what we do, I do use the pin briefly, but I've got all of my pieces. I labeled them all, so these are all D1. I have my pattern marked piece, I have my interior piece, and I have my exterior piece. And I'm going to make a big sandwich. So you line up your exterior fabric and your middle fabric, trying to get them all neatly lined up, and tap and pull and check to make sure everything's all neatly lined up. And then we do the same with the piece with our pattern markings on it. And now I can take my pin, and I do hold it together like this briefly to make sure it doesn't escape when I'm getting ready to do the sewing. But now I've got this nice little packet. The nice fabric is on the outside, the marked fabric is on the inside, and then I'll be able to sew along all of my allowance lines. I basted inside the allowance because I'm going to be doing a lot of sewing interior to that, and I don't want these stitches to become permanent and get caught in any of the other stitching. So once I have everything all set up, I do a running stitch, and there's that bubble again that we're talking about. So I'll pull through, and then I set it down before I pull the thread all the way, and I kind of flatten it out, and then I tug the thread. I keep it flat, push my needle kind of through, and then pick it up, stab through and pull, because I'm trying to put as few bumps in this as I absolutely can. I want this to stay nice and flat. And I need to do this for every piece on each side. And then I can take it to the machine and start working on my boning channels. When I started this channel, I made a promise to myself and to you, my viewers, that I would not hide mistakes, real or stupid, because I think it's very important for people who haven't been sewing for very long to see that people who have been doing it for 20 plus years, as I have, still make mistakes. We do still do things that maybe don't make as much sense as they could, and that has happened. We are looking at one of the stay panel sections that I've been working on, and I just told you about how I was basting in the seam allowance so that I didn't have to worry about catching that when I went to sew things. I got through basically every panel before I realized I screwed up. On this, you do actually want to do your stitching along the seam allowance lines, and let me show you why. When I'm working on this, the next step will be to put the boning channels on, and I'm going to do it with this side up. That's where my line is, my initial line. So my boning line goes along here, and then it splits, and it goes one here and one here. That's all I'm going to sew from this side, because when you're sewing on a machine, as I will be, when your thread starts, the bobbin, the under thread, tends to make a little bit of a mess. So on the nice side of my fabric, I'm probably going to get a little bit of weirdness on the top when I start those lines. That's something that I need to be very careful about and be very aware of. But all of the other channels are going to be sewn using that channel as a guide. I'll be able to see where the thread goes, and I'll line my foot up accordingly. But I need to know when to stop, and I need to stop at the seam allowances. So I've come back through here with a red thread, because red is a lot easier for me to see. And as I'm doing those boning channels, I will know, don't start above this line, don't go below this line, and don't go outside of these lines. So now I'm going to go back through and I'm going to redo all of these pieces so that I can finally take this thing to the machine and start sewing some boning channels. The first step of sewing the boning channels is putting a guideline on each piece. The guidelines are either the stitching line that runs down the center of each piece or a line that splits at the bottom. Since the guidelines are marked on the back of the fabric, I have to work with the right side down. This is the only step where I'll be working from the back, and I'll show you why in a little bit. I start at the seam allowance and work down one side of the split to the allowance. Then I return to the top of the split and work the other side. It's important not to go too far past the allowance marks because it will make putting in properly sized bones harder later. Now that I have a guideline, I can start putting in the rest of the channels. You need to know the distance you need between the stitch lines, and there are two ways you can set up for that. You can either measure the distance on the pattern, or you can put the pattern under the presser foot and gauge where the needle needs to be from there. On this pattern, the channels are 1/4 inch apart, which means I don't need to adjust my needle position. It can stay centered, and the guideline needs to stay lined up with the edge of the foot. I work from the center outward so that any fabric bubbles get pushed off the piece. I also work every line top down. It doesn't matter if you work top down or bottom up, so long as you do every single channel in that same direction. Going through the machine puts a very small amount of stress on the fabric, and if you alternate going top down and bottom up, you'll start to see the fabric pucker. If you always go the same direction, that doesn't happen. Now that I have an example for you, I can go into a little bit more detail about why I do most of the stitching for the boning channels from the right side of the fabric. So this was the first line of stitching that I stitched, and you can see where it splits here, and all of this looks really nice. But the thing with sewing machines is that if it's going to screw up anywhere, it usually does it on the bobbin side or the underside of the fabric, which it has done on this piece. So I have all these extra threads that have gotten caught up and around each other, and I'm going to have to take a pin and try to pick out as much as I can and trim it down so that I don't have this nasty little bird's nesty thing. But bird nests like this and the big bad ones that really screw everything up that you have to cut out are the reason why I want to do most of my stitching from this side. If I were to have a problem with a bird nest, it's not going to end up where it's visible. It's going to end up over here, and I don't mind necessarily having a wad of thread in a line of stitching on this side because it's not making an impact on the pretty print. So it does add a little bit of extra thought. It does add a little bit of extra work, especially if you end up with a little gross bit like this anyway. But overall, it's a lot less risky to do most of your sewing from the nice side of the fabric so that any problems end up where you're not going to see them. We need to talk about an interesting type of problem you can have when you're working on pieces where you have to transfer a lot of information. You can see that my stitching lines do not necessarily match up with the boning channels that are on this piece. There is actually a very good reason for that. And the reason is I am human and prone to not doing things perfectly. My sewing machine, however, if you leave it alone and let it do its business, look how nice and straight this line is. That is an absolutely beautiful line, and that is the first line of boning channels that I put in. I did this, and I did its piece, and I did the split over here. To make all of the rest of the channels fit, I worked this way, keeping an eye on these other marked lines. But I know I've used these patterns a lot. They're already starting to come apart from the number of times I've run the tracing wheel on them. So I'm always a little bit suspicious of some of these lines. You can see it's a little bit thick where I was trying to retrace things. So I trust the accuracy of my sewing machine to make these nice lines more than I do my ability to draw them on. It has given me a little bit of a conundrum. So we have some difference in the slant on these lines over here, but you can see when it gets down near the bottom, everything kind of works its way out. Where we run into a little bit more trouble is that there are supposed to be 3 channels at the end of each of these. That's not quite happening, and the same was true on the companion piece here, where I just went ahead and stuck the other ones in anyway to see what it would do. That's something that I will tend to do from time to time just to see how big of a problem something might be. And it does pretty okay, but we come outside of the allowance lines a little bit, and I am not certain how big of a problem that's going to be. I have a couple options. I can unpick all of these lines and try it again. I prefer not to do that because it could leave marks on this side of the fabric. Also, I don't know if you've ever sewn on a Bernina, but they make really tight stitches that are very, very difficult to pick. So if I can avoid doing that, I usually will. One of my other options is to make the bone so it just comes up to where the allowance line is going to go and doesn't necessarily go all the way up the rest of the way. That way I still get the stiffness and the strength down here, but it's not interfering with the size and the shape of the piece. Fortunately, to make these stays, I need 104 pieces of boning. That's going to take a while. I have to cut them and sand them, so I have some time to think about these two pieces, and I can decide if I want to come in here and get that extra channel, or if I maybe just want to come up to that allowance section, which isn't a terrible idea, and try it that way. But I have some time, and I can go cut boning and think about it and decide what I want to do. We're to the part of making stays that isn't difficult, but it is kind of tedious because I need to cut over 100 bones to put in all of these channels that we've made. To do that, I am measuring out along each channel, and I mark it with my fingers so that it's a little bit smaller than the channel that I'm going into, and I cut a piece free. And now you get to see why I have nail files in my sewing kit, because we're going to move that out of the way of the dust. I need to file off the pointed edges. Those pointed edges are very sharp, and they can poke through your fabric, they can poke you, they can make holes. You don't want that. So it just takes a real quick file. Look at that, all the sharp edges are gone. We do that on both ends. And the reason we cut this a little bit shorter than the channel, we want it to fill the channel, but we don't want it to be in the way when we go and put the binding on. So that's part of why I try not to stitch too far past the seam allowance line. It makes it a little bit harder to get at the boning channels. So I have to come back in here and push that little piece in. And so we're still outside the seam allowance line on that end, but we've got a lot of space down here. So then you just kind of give it a little scooch to get it down past that allowance end. It's free and clear on this side, and I have to do every single channel. It takes a bit, but when it's done, it'll have a nice rigidity to it, and it will be very, very supportive. The front panel gets handled a little differently from the body panels. To start, I need to seam the pieces together down the center front and then flip the pieces around so that the proper layer is on the outside. I very much recommend checking your fabric stack a few times before you do the seam to make sure all of the layers are in the right place. Then you need to press the seam open and turn the layers right side out. This is why I used pencil and not a heat erase pen, by the way. I need to know where all those lines are, and it can take hours in the freezer to bring them back if you use a heat erase pen. The seam allowance here is much wider than it is on any other part of the stays. You want a wide allowance here because it's going to provide support for the eyelets and the center front bone that helps support the eyelets. The fabric is also pretty thick, so lots of heat and lots of steam really help to get everything nice and flat. I'm pressing on both sides because of the bulk of the seam. Before I turn the piece, I work on the other panel. This gives the main press a chance to cool and set before I fold the main fabric to the outside and press it over. Sewing in the boning channels is a little different for the front pieces too. Instead of running a guide down the center of the panel first, I need to work on the center front. I run a stitch line down the center front to stabilize the edge of that channel. To make sure the feed dogs can grab the fabric, I set the needle to the far edge and then stitch. Then I adjust my needle position to complete the two center front channels that flank the space where the eyelets will go. I'm starting here for two reasons. First, I've already got a seam anchored down, which means I need to work away from that to prevent fabric bubbles. Second, the rest of the channels are going to butt up against the center front channels, which means that they have to be in place first. The front panels also vary from the body panels in that there's an angle change in the channel orientation. Here I've already sewn my middle guide and worked to the center front. Now I need to make my second guide line and work out from it in order to make the next batch of channels angle properly. This part is done the same as it was on the body panels, where you put the guide line in first on the wrong side and then sew everything else from the right side, being careful not to go outside the seam allowance. The front is also a little different in that it uses two different sizes of boning. The bones that support the eyelet strip are much wider than the ones used in the main body of the stays. The process of cutting, smoothing, and inserting the bones is the same. Where I do things a little differently is with the tiny bones. I keep a small baggie of bone offcuts so that when I need smaller pieces, I have some on hand. I find it's a really good way to use up scraps and make sure my boning rolls, which are quite expensive, last for longer. After the bones are installed, I can start tacking down the seam allowance. All my allowances are still thread marked, so I know where to fold them. I fold each allowance down and give it a really good long steam to set it. The bones are in here, and that is totally fine. Even though they're plastic, they're being protected by the rest of the fabric, so it is completely safe to do this with the bones in. And remember, I've got 3 layers of fairly thick fabric that I'm folding over to make 6 layers of fabric, so it takes a bit more effort to get that to stay put. It's a little trickier around curves because you don't want to cut into the seam allowance at all. Any cuts will weaken the fabric and prevent you from being able to alter the stays in the future. By keeping as much allowance as possible, I'd be able to unpick and let out the stays later if I needed to. Having the allowances pressed makes it easier to keep the fabric in the right spot when you sew. It is a little tricky doing this with the bones in because they make the piece stiff and harder to work with, but you do have to do it this way. If you go out of order, it's very easy to sew the boning channels closed, and you'd have to unpick everything to get the bones back in. I'm using a widely spaced whip stitch for this. The goal is to keep the allowance flat and out of the way so you don't need to have really tightly packed stitches. I could have done them even wider, but I struggle not to do tiny stitches. Where you do really want to pack stitches in is the next step. It's time to connect the panels after I've removed the thread to mark the allowances. Point of fact, I probably should have done this set the theatrical way, where you seam the panels together by machine and then secure the allowance, but I did that last time and I really wanted to see how the historical method worked. It wasn't one of my best plans, and it took a lot longer than I expected. I'm using a thicker waxed linen thread for this and using densely packed whip stitches. The pattern calls for 18 to 25 stitches per inch, which is a lot. It's necessary though. These seams take a lot of stress, and having a lot of stitches close together makes the seams stronger. At this point, I thought I was going to be adding the straps, but when I went to review the instructions, I saw the directions for applying seam tape and remembered that I had wanted to do that. I only had the one size of tape though, and it was wider than I wanted for seam tape. Fortunately, this tape has that herringbone pattern, and I was able to fold it down the center very easily. I did give it a press to help keep it that way too, and it worked out really nicely as seam tape. One of the lines is purely decorative, and it follows the angle of the first set of channels on the front panel. The other line that I'm using does actually cover the seam between the front panel and the panel next to it. I opted not to use tape along every panel seam, both for time reasons and because I wanted it to be more of an accent than a feature. Once I got the seam tape whipped down, then I got to put the straps on. Each strap is 3 layers of fabric, just like all the other panels. I've only basted them together, not thread marked the seam allowance here, partly for time and partly because I didn't want thread where I was going to machine sew. The straps are connected at the top edge of the back, matching allowances on the strap and on the body. Then it's time for a very good press. I've got a ton of fabric to wrangle here. The body and the strap both have 3 layers, and by the time everything is finished being folded in the right direction, I had 9 layers of heavy fabric to deal with. I made sure to press on both sides multiple times, and probably should have gotten my clappers out to help press things down. The pattern did call for trimming down the body allowance before felling the strap allowance over it, but there was just so much there I ended up trimming down 2 layers of the strap allowance as well, and it cooperated much better after that. The uncut layer of allowance was wrapped around the cut edges and whipped into place. Before I got to binding, there was only one thing left to do, and that was put the eyelets in. Stays generally use spiral lacing, not crisscross lacing, which means the eyelets are offset halfway between the opposite side instead of being directly across from each other. I've marked the positions in pencil. Properly, I would use an awl to open a hole and then sew the eyelet with a buttonhole stitch. Instead, in part because it's easier, I'm using my leather punch to make a hole of the appropriate size and using 00 eyelets. When I squeeze the punch to make the hole, I don't open the punch back up right away. I rotate it around a little bit to make sure that it's cut through all of the layers before I open it. Then I can insert the eyelet on the front side, place it in the setter, position the eyelet ring, and use my mallet to set the eyelet. One day I'll buy an eyelet press, but for now, manually setting them works the best for me. And we're back to the sewing machine, but not to sew on the binding. Before we can do that, we need to sew around the edges of the stays at the allowance line to secure the bones in their channels. I very much recommend going slow and steady here. Chances are there's at least one bone that isn't where you think it is, and if you run over it at speed, it can and will break your needle. But if you go over it slowly, the needle will usually go through the bone. It's not great for the needle, so I also recommend replacing your needle before you go on to another project. If you've run over bones, it's dulled the needle and possibly damaged it, and it's much safer to swap it out. Now that we have an allowance line that we can see, it's time to trim the allowance off. I'm going to be cutting the allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch all the way around the stays, including the straps, which will be bound with the top edge. It's a good idea to be at least a little careful here too. As I was working, I did find a few places where the bones hadn't set in their channels quite as well as maybe they should. That means, unfortunately, that my fabric scissors had to deal with them, which isn't the best for the scissors. They can do it, but it's not fabric, so it will dull the edge, and I'm going to need to get my scissors in for a good sharpening after this project. And here the truly fiddly bit begins. I hate sewing binding. There are some sewing wizards out there that have a lot more practice than I do and can manage this on a machine. My best bet is doing it by hand. The top edge is the easier edge, so I'm starting there by securing the binding to the front side. I'm using twill tape here instead of bias tape or self fabric because you want whatever you use to be as thin as possible. I used self fabric on my wearable mock-up and it was incredibly bulky and made getting a nice edge nearly impossible. I'm using the pattern on the tape again, this time to make sure that I'm getting the same amount of tape to the front and back of the stays. Then begins the whip stitching. You don't need really close stitches here. The binding is expected to wear out and need to be replaced, so you want it to be fairly easy to remove. It's also not structural. That line of stitching we did is holding the bones in place, so the binding doesn't need to duplicate that. The open edges are a little special. To get a really clean edge, you need to wrap the tape around the stays. The front side is already secure, so I'm wrapping some excess around the edge and folding the back portion of the binding over it. Make sure you get the tail tucked all the way in, and then you're going to end up with a really nice, clean finish. From there, you can keep whipping down the binding on the inside of the stays. I'm binding the bottom edge of the stays now, and this I think is the fiddliest bit of the whole thing. It's reasonably challenging to get the binding up into the corners and have it look nice. There are a couple tricks that I figured out that you can do. The first is you want to use tape for this if at all possible. I know it's really tempting to want to use self fabric around the edges. You don't really want to do that because the self fabric on this stuff tends to be pretty thick, and it's much easier to get around all these corners if what you're working with is very, very thin. So even if you fold this in half, look how much thicker that is. When you're trying to get down into these little bitty corners, the less bulk, the better. It's already really hard to get this to lay nice and flat. So if you can avoid having extra material in there, it makes it so much easier. The other nice thing about tape is that you can see this one has a nice herringbone pattern. I can see exactly where the center of that tape is. So as I'm coming around here, I can make sure that I have relatively even sides. Now, I say relatively even because I always start on the front when I'm doing this. If you start on the back, you're given whatever leftovers are present when you come to the front. But the front is the side that everyone's going to see, which means it makes a lot more sense to start on the front and then make the back work however it needs to. The other thing you're going to notice is that this is still connected to the spool, but I haven't gone on to the next set of tabs. I try to only pin one working section at a time because if I were to pin this whole bottom edge, That's getting into sewing with a porcupine territory. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, it makes the whole thing a lot harder than it actually needs to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a modified whip stitch that I've come across as I was working on the top edge of this. I'll show you what I'm doing because it goes a lot faster and I think it'll hold up just as well. But step by step, little by little, I'm going to finesse all of these edges in. And let me go ahead and show you that modified whip stitch because it's been working really, really well and I think it'll really help speed this process along. As we know, when you do whip stitch, you take your needle, you pick up a little bit, you pick up a little bit, get some here, you pull through, and catch on those pins. That's why I don't pin very far in advance because it gets in the way. And then you come and you do that next section. That's great and all, except it's surprisingly difficult to go straight into that boundary. And you have this little traveling thread. What I noticed when I was doing the inner edge of the upper portion of the binding is that if I come in where my thread came out, let me pop that needle out so it's not in the way, holding everything where it needs to be. So if I come in here and travel sideways, I can pick up the thread a lot more easily. It's a lot easier to get the needle through the fabric. Flatten that down and then just do the same thing here. Now I am coming around a corner, so I do need to be a little bit careful about how this ends up working out. That's what makes this take as long as it does, because you have a lot of fiddly bits to deal with and a lot of pieces to make sure stay where they belong. But look how nice and neat that edge already is. Binding didn't have a lot of stitches going for it anyway, and like that one's a little bit bubbly, so I'm gonna go ahead and take that there and maybe tack it down a little bit differently. But by making just that small change in how I handle the needle, and yeah, we're going around corners, it gets a little bit more complicated. Nope, that's too far. You can have a good amount of travel. You just don't want a ton of travel as you do this. Come here. So I'm just catching that little bit each step around, and it goes through a lot easier, and I think it looks a lot nicer too. I can't tell if you can see, it just got this little bit of thread. It's a lot less obvious than, say, the whip stitching that I've got along these panels, which you can very clearly see from quite a distance away. So that is how I'm going to get all the way around here, and when I come down to this little creasy bit, I'm going to show that to you again. Braver souls than I can do this on a sewing machine. I am not that brave. I do not trust myself to be able to get this corner looking nice, so I apologize that this is going to be a little difficult to see. When you're binding like this, you need a lot of movement. You need to be able to manipulate things and move things around a lot. That makes it a little bit tricky when you're the sewist and the camera operator. So what we're going to try to do here is get this as flat as possible and cover up these edges that I didn't quite get in quite the right spot. It's fiddly. You absolutely need some kind of thimble if you're doing this, because it's reasonably challenging to get the needle through all of this material. Let's see if I can't just pull you that in place. Don't know that I want to come from that far back, but let's see what this does. Lessons learned on that when you're adding decorative things. Leave a lot of extra. You'd think I'd know that. That's part of why I don't cut this, because as things come around, if I had pre-cut this, there's a very good chance that by the time I get to the end, I will have a different amount of fabric. I'm just kind of pull that down. The nice thing is this is one of those areas that people don't really look at super closely. So whatever you can get in here is generally okay. Ow. And so we've gotten that. Maybe not as nice as it could be, but pretty okay. I may come in and tack some of that fuzz down so it doesn't fray on me later. And then I'm all good to go and come up this portion of the tab. Now if you come to something that's nice and pointy like this, what I like to do is just kind of miter that corner. So I'll sew along the edge, make sure that's tacked down, and continue on the rest of the way. And that is how you get the binding on this thing. I just don't even know what to say about these stays right now. I love them so much. When I made my mock-up, when I made my first try, I didn't want to take them off. That kind of goes double for this pair. They are just so beautiful. This fabric was absolutely perfect for this project. I have zero regrets about getting that first length of fabric. It is very clearly perfect, absolutely perfect for this purpose. They were a bit of a bear to get together. I was really pressed for time because I had a couple bad weeks in there, and I kind of feel like I've forgiven the stays for that because, I mean, how can you not? They're gorgeous. I don't want to take these off. I want to wear them every day for the rest of my life. I like them that much. Honestly, if it wouldn't murder my fingers, I would probably start cutting another pair and just let the rest of the projects with that fabric go. I like this that much. That is precisely why I'm going to keep continuing with the project of seeing exactly how far I can stretch all of this fabric, because if I love the stays this much, there's no telling how I'm going to feel about the gown. There are a couple areas where the stays could probably use some improvement. I didn't mock up the straps, and I probably should because my shoulders are slopey. I should have thought of that. I should have angled the base of them. But done is done. I don't care. I may take a little fold and pinch out of that and see if I can get it to lay a little bit flatter without it looking too strange. I could possibly unpick it and try it again, although the allowances have been trimmed, so that does make that a little bit more challenging. But the bigger thing is I don't care. I like these stays so much that the tiny little fit issues around the back of the straps, not super fussed about that. These stays are perfect, they are beautiful, and I absolutely love them. I could not be happier. I will almost certainly be making more stays once my fingers calm down a little bit and I get through my other projects. But for now, I'm just going to live in these for a while. If you've never worn corsets or stays, you see a lot of actresses especially complaining about how they're not comfortable. If you can't tell right now, I am sitting down. I am sitting down on my couch. I am experiencing no discomfort. Now, I haven't worn a garment this snug for a while, so it does feel a little bit different. But when you're wearing something like this that's properly made and properly fitted, it's like leaning into a very comfortable hug. It is so supportive. I personally enjoy the compression quite a lot. I will tight lace anything I can because the squeeze is just so soothing and so lovely. But just sitting here talking with you now, I'm not getting any pinching around the waist. I'm not getting any uncomfortable snugness around the ribs. I can tell that it's snug. I can tell that my breathing is altered a little bit just because my lungs can't expand quite as much as they would normally, but it's not really a problem. It isn't uncomfortable at all. I'm not having difficulty breathing. I'm not having difficulty sitting. If anything, my posture is actually probably a little bit better than it usually is because I have a whole bunch of bones across my back helping to hold me up right now. I am literally like leaning into the stays to support myself, and it is the most amazing feeling ever. I'm not sure what I'll have for you next time. I've got a lot of projects in the works, mostly with this floral fabric, but also some accessories. I also need to do something that hurts my fingers a little bit less because they're going to be sore for quite a while. That is a side effect of stays. When you do a lot of the work by hand, you do get very, very sore fingers. So stick around, come on back, and I'll have an accessory or a floral fabric item for you next time. I'll see you soon. And that wraps us up for today. So I will see you back here soon with another piece from this collection or an accessory. I'm not really sure which. And when I figure that out, I'll get something up for you and I'll see you back here real soon. Bye.